At 5:43 on the morning of May 14, 1945, Corporal Vance was dying by inches in the mud of Okinawa. He was crouched at the bottom of a foxhole that had dissolved into a brown soup of rainwater and clay. The Japanese artillery had been hammering the position for 6 straight hours. The sound was not a noise anymore. It was a physical pressure that vibrated in his teeth and rattled the bones in his chest. Every time a shell landed, the ground heaved like a sleeping animal waking up, and the mud walls of his trench squeezed in a little tighter. Vance was 22 years old, but in the gray light of dawn, with dirt packed into the creases of his face and his eyes sunken from 3 days without sleep, he looked 50. He was watching a patch of tall kunite grass 30 yards to his front. The grass was motionless, but Vance knew the enemy was there. They were waiting for the artillery to stop. When the shells stopped falling, the Japanese infantry would start running. The real problem wasn't the artillery. The problem was the weapon Vance was holding. It was a standard-issue M1 Garand rifle. It was a masterpiece of American engineering, a semi-automatic precision instrument that could put a .30 caliber bullet through a helmet at 400 yards. The generals in Washington loved it. The officers in the rear loved it. But down here in the mud, in a hole the size of a coffin, the Garand was a liability. It was 43 inches long and weighed nearly 10 pounds. In the open fields of Europe, it was the weapon that won the war. But on Okinawa, the war was not fought in open fields. It was fought in caves, in tunnels, and in trenches that zigzagged like broken glass. When a Japanese soldier jumped into your hole with a knife, he was usually less than 3 feet away. Trying to swing a 43-inch rifle in a narrow trench was like trying to swing a baseball bat inside a phone booth. By the time you got the barrel around, you were already dead. Vance looked at the rifle in his hands. The wood stock was slick with oil and rain. The action was jammed with grit. He hated it. He had spent the last week watching good men die because their weapons were too long, too slow, or too precise for the chaotic brutality of a knife fight in the dark. He had seen a private from the 2nd platoon try to clear a spider hole with a carbine, only to be dragged underground by an enemy he couldn't bring his weapon to bear on. The war had changed. The distance between life and death had shrunk from hundreds of yards to the length of an arm. And yet, the Marine Corps insisted that every man be a rifleman. They insisted on the doctrine of aimed fire. They insisted on the tools of a gentleman's war. Vance gripped the Garand until his knuckles turned white. He knew what was coming out of that grass. He knew the rifle wouldn't save him. He needed the weapon they had told him to leave behind. 6 months earlier, back at the staging area in the Russell Islands, the scene had been very different. The sun was shining, the ocean was blue, and the mood was almost light. The battalion was refitting for the invasion, unboxing crates of brand new equipment fresh from the factories in Detroit and Connecticut. Men were wiping cosmoline grease off new machine guns and arguing over who got the new flamethrowers. In the middle of this industrial Christmas morning, Vance had walked over to the supply sergeant and made a specific request. He didn't want a new rifle. He didn't want a submachine gun. He handed the sergeant a requisition form for a Winchester Model 12 pump-action shotgun. The reaction was immediate. The supply sergeant had laughed so hard he dropped his clipboard. He asked Vance if he was planning to go duck hunting on the weekends. The laughter drew a crowd. A lieutenant from Fox Company walked over, saw the shotgun on the table, and shook his head. He picked up the weapon, holding it by the barrel like a dead fish. He made a show of inspecting it, looking down the wide, smooth bore, and then looking back at Vance with a smirk. He asked if Vance expected the Japanese to fly over in V formation. He called the shotgun a farmer's toy. He called it a bird gun. He told the gathered men that Vance must have confused the United States Marine Corps with a pheasant hunting trip in Nebraska. The men laughed. It was the kind of deep, mocking laughter that separates the insiders from the outcasts. They looked at the shotgun, with its wooden slide and its old-fashioned, hammerless profile, and they saw a relic. It looked like something you would find above a fireplace in a log cabin, not on the front lines of the greatest war in human history. Vance stood there and took it. He didn't smile, and he didn't argue. He took the shotgun back from the lieutenant and began cleaning it. He stripped it down with a practiced efficiency that stopped the laughter for a second. He wiped the bolt, checked the carrier, and oiled the slide. He knew something the lieutenant didn't. He knew that the Winchester Model 12 was not a toy. It was a machine built for a specific kind of violence. It held 6 shells in the tube and 1 in the chamber. Each shell contained 9 pellets of double-aught buckshot. Each pellet was the size of a .32 caliber bullet. That meant every time Vance pulled the trigger, he wasn't firing 1 round, he was firing 9, and he could fire them as fast as he could pump his arm. The mockery didn't stop at the supply depot. It followed him onto the transport ships. During the long weeks at sea, while While other Marines were sharpening bayonets and zeroing their sights, Vance was sitting on his bunk practicing his reload. The other guys in the platoon called him the farmer. They would toss empty ration cans at him and tell him to pull. They made bets on how long he would last before he threw the shotgun away and picked up a real rifle off a dead body. Even his own squad leader, a grim sergeant who had survived Guadalcanal, told him to get rid of it. The sergeant explained the logistics of war to Vance like he was a child. He explained that shotgun ammunition was heavy and bulky. He explained that the effective range was only 40 yards. He explained that if the Japanese engaged them from a ridgeline 200 yards away, Vance would be useless. He would be a spectator in the firefight, unable to shoot back, a dead weight on the squad. Vance listened to every word. He understood the arguments. On paper, the officers were right. In a textbook war where lines were drawn on maps and enemies engaged at respectful distances, the shotgun was a joke. It had no range. It had no penetration against light armor. It was inaccurate. But Vance wasn't preparing for a textbook war. He was preparing for the nightmare he saw in his head. He had listened to the stories from the veterans of Peleliu and Tarawa. He heard about the bunkers. He heard about the enemies who didn't surrender, who hid in holes until you walked right over them, and then popped up to shoot you in the back. He heard about the charges at night, where the enemy came in waves, screaming and stabbing, and there was no time to aim. In those moments, accuracy didn't matter. Volume mattered. Stopping power mattered. When a man is running at you with a bayonet and he is 5 feet away, you don't need to hit his heart with a surgical strike. You need to pick him up and throw him backward. You need to turn the air in front of you into a solid wall of lead. The rifle was a scalpel. The shotgun was a sledgehammer. And Vance knew that when the enemy was in the trench with you, you didn't want to perform surgery. You wanted to smash everything in front of you until it stopped moving. So he kept the gun. He endured the jokes. He endured the insults. He slept with the shotgun wrapped in oilcloth to keep the sea salt from rusting the receiver. When they climbed down the cargo nets into the landing craft off the coast of Okinawa, the lieutenant shouted one last warning at him. He told Vance that when the shooting started, nobody was going to cover him while he played with his bird gun. Now, in the mud of the foxhole, the shooting was about to start. The artillery barrage lifted. The silence that followed was heavy and terrifying. Then the whistle blew. Not an American whistle, a Japanese signal whistle. It shrieked from the tree line, high and piercing. The grass in front of Vance's position stopped being grass and started being men. Hundreds of them. They rose up from the earth like ghosts, mud dripping from their uniforms, bayonets fixed on their Arisaka rifles. They didn't yell at first, they just ran. A silent gray wave crashing toward the American lines. Vance dropped the M1 Garand. He let it splash into the mud at his feet. He didn't look at it. He reached behind him, into the dry recess he had dug into the trench wall, and pulled out the Winchester. The oilcloth fell away. The blue steel gleamed dully in the rain. He racked the slide, clack, clack. The sound was mechanical and heavy, a sound that meant business. The Marine next to him, a kid named Miller who had spent the whole voyage making duck noises every time Vance walked by, was frantically trying to load a clip into his rifle. Miller's hands were shaking. He fumbled the clip. It pinged against the receiver and fell into the dirt. Miller looked up, his eyes wide with panic. He looked at the wave of enemies rushing toward them, now only 20 yards away. He looked at his jammed rifle, then he looked at Vance. Vance didn't look back. He stepped up to the lip of the trench. He didn't shoulder the shotgun like a rifle. He tucked the stock under his armpit, clamping it tight against his ribs. He leveled the barrel at the center of the charging mass. The Japanese soldiers were screaming now, a guttural roar of Banzai that drowned out the rain. The first runner was 15 yards away. Vance could see the gold teeth in the man's mouth. He could see the stitching on his collar. He could see the intent in his eyes. The lieutenant had called it a toy. The squad had called it a joke. They had laughed at the idea of bringing a bird gun to a war. But as Vance's finger tightened on the trigger, he knew the time for laughing was over. The experts had their theories, but the enemy was here, and the theories were about to die. Vance took a breath, held it, and prepared to show them exactly what a bird gun could do to a man. The first shot didn't sound like a rifle crack. It sounded like a cannon going off inside a closet. Vance pulled the trigger, and the Winchester Model 12 kicked into his shoulder with the force of a mule. A cone of flame erupted from the muzzle, 3 feet long and bright orange against the gray rain. Inside that cone were 9 lead pellets, each one moving at 1,200 feet per second. The lead Japanese soldier, the one with the gold teeth who was 15 yards away, simply stopped existing. The buckshot hit him in the chest and lifted him off his feet. He didn't fall forward. He was thrown backward as if he had run into an invisible telephone pole. His charge ended in a wet mist of red and khaki, but Vance didn't stop to admire his work. He didn't have time. There were 20 more men behind the first one, and they were closing the distance at a sprint. This was the moment where the toy became a monster. This was the moment where the design flaw became a feature. In a modern pump shotgun, there is a safety mechanism called a trigger disconnector. This means that after you fire a shot and pump the slide to load a new shell, you have to release the trigger and pull it again to fire. It forces you to be deliberate. It forces you to be safe. But the Winchester Model 12 was designed in 1912, before lawyers and safety committees got involved in gun manufacturing. It had no disconnector. If you held the trigger down and pumped the slide, the gun would fire the instant the bolt locked forward. You didn't have to pull. You just had to pump. As long as your finger was squeezed tight and your arm was moving, the gun became an engine. It became a hand-cranked machine gun. Vance held the trigger down. He slammed the forend back, ejecting the spent shell, and slammed it forward. Boom. The second runner, a sergeant waving a sword, folded in half. Vance pumped again. Clack, clack, boom. The third man spun around, his legs taken out from under him. Vance was working the slide so fast his arm was a blur. The sound wasn't separate gunshots anymore. It was a rhythmic, mechanical pounding. Clack, clack, boom. Clack, clack, boom, clack, clack, boom. In less than 4 seconds, Vance had emptied the magazine. 6 shells, 54 pellets. He had put a wall of lead into the air that was 12 feet wide and 4 feet high. The front rank of the Banzai charge didn't just break, it evaporated. The men behind them faltered. They had expected single shots. They had expected the ping of a Garand and the pause for a reload. They hadn't expected a buzzsaw. The empty gun clicked. Vance didn't freeze. He dropped below the trench line, his hands moving with the muscle memory he had built during those long nights on the ship. He didn't try to load the magazine tube. That took too long. He grabbed a single shell from his belt pouch and dropped it directly into the open ejection port. He racked the slide forward. He popped up. A Japanese soldier was at the rim of the trench, bayonet raised, looking down at Miller. Vance fired from the hip. The soldier disappeared. Vance ducked again. He fed another shell. Racked, popped up, fired. It was a brutal, ugly rhythm. Load one, shoot one. Load one, shoot one. He was a piston engine of violence. Miller, the kid who had mocked him, was still fumbling with his rifle clip, his face pale, staring at Vance like he was seeing a demon. The Japanese charge shattered. The momentum was gone. The survivors, seeing the carnage at the front, dove for cover or retreated back into the kunite grass. The silence returned, but it wasn't the same silence as before. It was ringing with the smell of gunpowder and the metallic heat radiating from the shotgun's barrel. Vance stood there, his chest heaving. The barrel of the Winchester was smoking, the heat waves shimmering in the rain. His shoulder felt like it had been hit with a sledgehammer, but he was alive. Miller was alive. The trench line was unbroken. The lieutenant came running down the line, pistol in hand, screaming orders to hold fire. He skidded to a stop next to Vance's foxhole. He looked at the bodies piled in the mud 10 yards away. He looked at the shredded vegetation. Then he looked at Vance. He looked at the bird gun in Vance's hands. The lieutenant opened his mouth to say something, maybe to give an order, maybe to make a comment, but nothing came out. He just stared. The mockery was gone. There was no smirk. There was only the cold, hard realization that the farmer's toy had just done the work of a heavy machine gun squad. The lieutenant swallowed hard, nodded once at Vance, and moved down the line to check the other positions. He didn't tell Vance to pick up a rifle. He didn't mention pheasants. He knew better now. But the day was far from over. The attack at dawn was just a probe. The Japanese commander knew exactly where the American line was now, and he knew they were dug in. As the sun began to set, turning the sky a bruised purple, the dynamic of the battle changed. The Japanese army on Okinawa didn't fight like the Germans in Europe. They didn't just attack, they infiltrated. They were masters of the night. They would crawl on their bellies through the mud, moving inches at a time, until they were right on top of you. They used knives and grenades. They sought to neutralize the American advantage in firepower by getting so close that the Americans couldn't shoot without hitting their own men. Darkness fell like a heavy blanket. The rain started again, harder this time. Visibility dropped to 0. You couldn't see your hand in front of your face. This was the terrifying time. Every shadow looked like a man. Every sound, a snapping twig, a shifting stone, sounded like death. The men with the Garands were nervous. A long rifle is clumsy in the dark. If you miss your first shot, the muzzle flash blinds you, and by the time your eyes adjust, the enemy is on you. The Garand was designed to hit targets at 300 yards. At 3 feet, in the pitch black, it was just a clumsy club. Vance sat in the corner of the listening post, listening to the rain hiss against his helmet. He had cleaned the mud off the Winchester. He had reloaded the tube with 6 fresh shells, red paper hulls with brass bases. He held the gun across his lap. He felt a tap on his shoulder. It was the sergeant, the same one who had told him to throw the gun away. The sergeant whispered hoarsely that he heard movement near the wire, about 20 yards out. He asked Vance to take the point. It wasn't a request. It was an admission. The sergeant knew that if they started shooting blindly with rifles, they would give away their position and hit nothing. He needed the broom. Vance moved to the sandbags. He listened. He could hear it, a wet, sucking sound in the mud. Someone was crawling. Someone was cutting the barbed wire. It was a subtle sound, snip-snip, barely audible over the rain. Vance didn't need to see them. That was the beauty of the shotgun. He knew the general direction. He knew the spread pattern of his weapon. At 20 yards, the shot would spread out to the size of a large trash can. He didn't need to be precise. He just needed to be close. He waited. He let them get closer. He wanted them committed. The sound of crawling got louder. He could hear breathing. He could smell the faint, fishy odor of the ration rice the Japanese soldiers carried. They were right there, maybe 10 yards out, preparing to rush the hole. Vance stood up. He didn't yell. He didn't turn on a flashlight. He just racked the slide. Clack, clack. The sound was unmistakable. In the quiet tension of the night, the sound of a pump-action shotgun racking a shell is one of the most terrifying noises in the world. It is a mechanical, violent sound that says, "I am ready." The crawling stopped instantly. The enemy froze. They knew that sound. Every soldier in the Pacific knew that sound. It meant that whatever was waiting for them in the dark wasn't going to fire a single bullet that might miss. It meant a cloud of death was coming. Vance aimed at the sound and squeezed the trigger. Boom. The muzzle flash lit up the night like a lightning strike. For a split second, the scene was frozen in a strobe light effect. 3 Japanese infiltrators, caught in the wire, mud on their faces, grenades in their hands. The shot hit the middle man. He went down. The darkness slammed back down instantly, blinding everyone. But Vance didn't need to see. He knew where the others were. He held the trigger. Pump. Boom. He shifted the barrel 2 feet to the right. Pump. Boom. He shifted left. Pump. Boom. He fired 4 shots in 2 seconds. He swept the area in front of the wire like a man watering a lawn with a fire hose. The screams were short and sharp, then cut off. Vance ducked back down below the sandbags as a Japanese machine gun opened up from the ridge line, red tracers snapping over his head. But the infiltrators were gone. The threat right in front of their faces had been erased. Miller, huddling in the bottom of the hole, looked up at Vance. Miller whispered, asking if he got them. Vance didn't answer. He just ejected the empty shells and started thumbing fresh ones into the tube. Click, click, click. The rhythm was calm, steady. Vance wasn't shaking. He had found his place in this war. He wasn't a sniper. He wasn't a rifleman. He was a janitor. His job was to clean up the messes that happened when things got too close, and business was good. The next morning, the battalion received orders to move up. The defensive hold was over. Headquarters wanted them to take the Sugar Loaf, a small, unassuming hill that anchored the entire Japanese defensive line. It looked like a pile of dirt, innocent and empty. But the intelligence reports were wrong. It wasn't empty. It was a fortress. And to take it, they wouldn't just be fighting in foxholes. They would be entering the labyrinth. The Japanese had dug 4 concentric rings of trenches around the hill, connected by tunnels, spider holes, and concrete bunkers. It was a meat grinder designed to chew up infantry battalions. The captain called the platoon leaders together. He explained the mission. They were going to assault the first trench line at 0800. It was going to be a frontal assault, bayonets fixed. Close quarters. The captain looked around the circle of dirty, tired faces. His eyes stopped on Vance. He pointed at the shotgun. He didn't make a joke this time. He told Vance to get up front. He told the squad leaders that when they hit the trench, nobody went in before the shotgun. Vance nodded. He checked his pockets. He had 40 rounds of buckshot left. It sounded like a lot. He had a feeling it wouldn't be enough. He topped off the magazine, racked the slide one more time, and stepped to the front of the column. The toy was leading the charge. The assault on Sugar Loaf began at 0800 with a whistle blast that signaled the end of living and the beginning of dying. The ground between the American line and the first Japanese trench was 70 yards of open, churned-up mud. It was a kill zone. The Japanese had machine gun nests interlocking from both sides of the hill, creating a crossfire that looked like an invisible X drawn in the air. Anything that walked into that X got cut in half. The first wave of Marines stood up and sprinted. Within 10 seconds, half of them were down. The sound of the battlefield was a continuous, tearing roar of Nambu heavy machine guns and the snapping of bullets hitting mud. The attack stalled instantly. Men dove into shell craters, pressed their faces into the dirt, and screamed for corpsemen. The entire advance was pinned down, paralyzed by the sheer volume of lead flying over their heads. Vance was in a crater about 30 yards from the first trench. The air above him was sizzling. He watched a radio operator try to crawl forward, only to be hit in the helmet and stop moving. The attack was dead in the water. The officers were shouting, trying to get men to move, but nobody could move. To stand up was suicide. The Japanese in the first trench were emboldened now. They started popping up over the parapet, throwing grenades down at the pinned Marines. They were laughing. They knew they had won. They had the high ground, they had the machine guns, and they had the Americans stuck in the mud. Vance looked at the trench line. It was a zigzag scar in the earth, reinforced with logs and sandbags. If they stayed here, they would all die. The mortars would start falling any second. The only safety was inside the enemy trench. Vance checked the heat shield on his Winchester. It was still warm from the night before. He looked at Miller, who was curled up in the bottom of the crater, praying. Vance didn't say a word. He stood up. He didn't run like a sprinter. He ran like a linebacker, head down, shotgun tucked tight. A line of bullets kicked up dirt near his boots, but the Japanese gunners were focused on the main group. They didn't pay enough attention to the one lone idiot running straight at them with a pump gun. Vance hit the lip of the first trench and jumped. He landed feet first in 6 inches of water, right in the middle of a squad of 5 Japanese riflemen. They were so surprised to see an American fall out of the sky that they froze for a split second. That split second was all Vance needed. He didn't even shoulder the weapon. He fired from the hip. Boom. The first shot hit the soldier to his left, blowing him back against the log wall. Vance pumped. Boom. The second soldier, who was raising his rifle, took a load of buckshot to the stomach. Vance spun. Boom. The third man tried to stab him, but the shot caught him mid-lunge. The noise in the confined space of the trench was deafening. It wasn't just loud, it was a physical concussion that slammed against the eardrums. Clack, clack, boom. The fourth man fell. Clack, clack, boom. The fifth man dropped his rifle and tried to run, but there was nowhere to go. The first trench was clear for 20 yards in both directions. Vance didn't stop. The trench system on Sugar Loaf was connected by communication tunnels, narrow, claustrophobic earthen hallways that linked the outer defenses to the inner ones. Vance reloaded on the move, shoving shells into the magazine tube with bloody thumbs. He could hear shouting coming from the connecting tunnel. Reinforcements. A group of Japanese soldiers was rushing down the narrow corridor to plug the breach. They were bunched up shoulder to shoulder, bayonets leading the way. In a tunnel, bunching up is a death sentence if the other guy has a shotgun. Vance stepped to the corner of the tunnel and unleashed hell. He held the trigger down and slammed the slide back and forth. The slam fire mechanism turned the Winchester into a flamethrower of lead. The tunnel magnified the blast. The buckshot ricocheted off the hard clay walls, creating a shredding effect that tore through everything. The lead Japanese soldiers didn't just fall, they were pushed backward into the men behind them, creating a logjam of bodies. The screams echoed down the tunnel, amplifying the horror. Vance emptied the gun, pumped the slide on an empty chamber, and immediately started reloading. His hands were shaking now, not from fear, but from the adrenaline dumping into his blood. He had just killed an entire squad in under 10 seconds. He moved into the second trench line. This one was deeper, better fortified. There was a heavy machine gun nest here, a bunker built of coconut logs and dirt that was raking the American lines below. The gun crew inside was focused on the targets down the hill. They didn't hear Vance coming up behind them because the sound of their own gun was too loud. Vance walked right up to the rear aperture of the bunker. He didn't throw a grenade. He stuck the barrel of the Model 12 through the opening and fired 3 rapid shots. The machine gun stopped firing instantly. The silence that followed was heavy. Vance kicked the door open to check the room. The devastation inside was total. The buckshot had bounced around the concrete interior like angry hornets. The crew was gone. The threat to the company below was neutralized, but now the Japanese knew he was there. The element of surprise was gone. As Vance emerged from the bunker, he saw movement on both sides of the trench. They were coming for him. A Japanese officer, screaming orders, led a charge from the left. At the same time, soldiers popped up from spider holes on the right. Vance was surrounded. This was the moment the Garand would have failed. A rifleman can only look one way. A rifleman has to aim. Vance didn't aim. He swept. He turned to the left and fired 2 rounds, dropping the officer and his runner. He spun 180 degrees, a move that would have been impossible with a heavy machine gun, and fired 2 rounds at the spider holes. The dirt exploded around the holes, forcing the enemy heads down. He was out of ammo again. The Winchester clicked dry. This was the nightmare. A Japanese soldier with a sword charged from 10 feet away, seeing the American's gun was empty. Vance didn't have time to load a shell. He didn't have time to draw a knife. He used the shotgun as a club. He stepped into the charge, swung the heavy walnut stock of the shotgun, and smashed it into the soldier's jaw. The wood cracked, but the soldier went down hard. Vance stomped a boot onto the man's chest to keep him down and frantically shoved 1 shell into the chamber. Clack! He fired into the prone soldier. Then he loaded the tube. His fingers were slippery with sweat and rain. He dropped a shell in the mud. He cursed, grabbed another, jammed it in. He cleared the rest of the second trench by pure aggression. He moved forward so fast the enemy couldn't set up a defense. He turned corners firing. He fired at shadows. He fired at movement. He fired until the barrel of the shotgun was so hot it began to smoke and smell of burning wood. The heat shield, the metal grate on top of the barrel, was sizzling, searing the skin of his left hand, but Vance didn't feel it. He was in a trance state of violence. He had become the trench broom. He reached the third trench line. This was the main support line. It was filled with reserve troops who were preparing to counterattack. There were at least 20 of them. They were gathering grenades, checking weapons. They looked up and saw a lone American Marine, covered in mud and blood, holding a smoking shotgun. They hesitated. It was a fatal pause. Vance didn't hesitate. He opened fire on the group. The psychological effect of the shotgun was now doing more work than the pellets. The Japanese soldiers had seen what this weapon did to their comrades in the first two lines. They had heard the rhythmic boom-clack-boom, getting closer and closer. They knew that in this narrow ditch, that sound meant death. Panic broke out in the third trench. Instead of rushing him, some of the soldiers tried to scramble out the back of the trench to get away from the muzzle blast. Vance shot them in the back as they climbed. He shot the ones who stood and fought. He moved through the trench like a force of nature, stepping over bodies, pumping the slide, feeding shells. He was a machine. The mechanism of the Winchester, steel and wood and spring, was perfectly synchronized with the man. He was firing faster than a man with a semi-automatic rifle could acquire targets. He was clearing the trench simply by filling the air with lead. By the time he reached the fourth trench, the command post at the top of the hill, he was down to his last 5 shells. He was exhausted. His lungs were burning. His left hand was blistered from the heat of the barrel. He kicked open the wooden door of the command dugout. Inside, 3 Japanese officers were destroying maps and documents. They looked up, their pistols drawn. Vance fired his remaining rounds. Boom, boom, boom. The room went silent. Vance stood in the doorway of the fourth trench. The rain was still falling. The smoke from his shotgun drifted out into the wet air. He clicked the trigger. Empty. He pumped the slide. Empty. He checked his belt. No more shells. He was completely dry. He slumped against the wall of the trench, sliding down into the mud. His chest was heaving. He looked back down the hill. Below him, the American Marines were standing up. They were looking at the hill. The machine guns had stopped. The grenades had stopped. The hill was silent. They saw a single figure standing at the crest, silhouetted against the gray sky. They started to cheer. They started to run up the slope, no longer pinned down, no longer dying in the mud. Vance watched them come. He looked at the shotgun in his lap. The wood was cracked. The finish was scratched. The barrel was black with soot. It was the ugliest, most battered thing he had ever seen, and it was the most beautiful. The officers had laughed. They had called it a bird gun. Vance closed his eyes and listened to the rain. He wondered if any of them were laughing now. The rain finally stopped around noon. The sun broke through the gray overcast of Okinawa, illuminating the devastation on top of Sugar Loaf Hill. The silence that settled over the battlefield was heavy, almost vibrating. It was the specific kind of silence that only happens after hours of deafening noise. The Marines of the second wave reached the summit, their weapons raised, expecting a fight. What they found instead was a graveyard. They walked past the first trench, then the second, then the third. They saw the results of the bird gun. It didn't look like the aftermath of a firefight. A rifle fight leaves neat holes. A machine gun fight leaves lines of impacts. This looked like a natural disaster. It looked like a tornado had gone through the trenches, shredding sandbags, splintering wood, and tearing men apart. The Marines lowered their rifles. They walked slowly, stepping over the debris, their eyes wide. They weren't looking at the enemy dead with hate anymore. They were looking with a strange mixture of horror and respect for the violence that had ended them. Vance was sitting on a crate of Japanese mortar shells near the command dugout. He had wiped the mud off his face, but his hands were still black with soot. The Winchester Model 12 lay across his knees. It looked like a piece of junk. The wood of the forend was cracked from the force of the slam firing. The metal was dull and scratched. The heat shield was warped, but to the men gathering around him, it looked like Excalibur. The laughter was gone. The jokes about pheasant hunting were gone. The men looked at the battered shotgun with a kind of religious awe. They understood now. They understood that in the tight, terrifying confines of the trenches, the toy was the king. The lieutenant, the same officer who had made the crack about flying in V formation, climbed into the trench. He looked tired. He had lost a third of his platoon getting up the hill. He walked over to Vance. He didn't say anything at first. He just looked at the cleared bunkers. He looked at the bodies of the Japanese squad that had tried to rush the tunnel. Then he looked at Vance. He took off his helmet and ran a hand through his dirty hair. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a pack of cigarettes. He offered one to Vance. It was a small gesture, but in the Marine Corps, it meant everything. It was an apology. It was an admission that rank didn't matter and manuals didn't matter. Results mattered. The lieutenant lit the cigarette for Vance, then looked at the shotgun. He asked quietly if Vance could find another one for the point man of the second squad. This moment on Sugar Loaf wasn't just a victory for Vance, it was the vindication of an entire class of weapon. Throughout the war, the shotgun had been the unwanted stepchild of the American arsenal. It was considered ungentlemanly. It was considered crude. In the First World War, the German government had actually issued a diplomatic protest against the American use of shotguns. They called it a war crime. They threatened to execute any American prisoner caught with a shotgun or a shotgun shell. They argued that the weapon caused unnecessary suffering. Think about that for a second. The Germans, who introduced poison gas and flamethrowers to the battlefield, thought the shotgun was too cruel for war. They were terrified of it. They called the Winchester the trench broom because it swept the trenches clean of life. The Japanese on Okinawa felt the same terror. They were warriors who believed in the spirit of the blade, in the honor of close combat. They wanted to get close. They wanted to look you in the eye, but the shotgun denied them that. It turned their bravery into meat. It didn't care about their martial arts or their samurai spirit. It was a machine of industrial slaughter that didn't miss. When the Japanese commanders realized that the Americans were using pump-action shotguns in the tunnels, the fear spread through their ranks. It wasn't the fear of death, it was the fear of being erased. A rifle bullet kills you, a shotgun blast disassembles you. And on Sugar Loaf, Vance had shown them exactly why the Germans had tried to ban it. Vance didn't think about the politics or the history. He just smoked his cigarette and watched the medical jeeps moving down in the valley. He was 22 years old and he felt empty. The adrenaline crash was hitting him hard. His hands started to shake, the coffee cup rattle of post-combat shock. He looked at the Winchester. He had loved that gun. He had cleaned it, cared for it, defended it against every insult. But now, looking at it, he didn't feel pride. He felt a cold distance. The gun had done its job. It had saved his life. It had saved the lives of the men standing around him. But it had done it by turning him into a butcher. He rubbed his thumb over the receiver, feeling the grit of the action. He knew he would never hunt birds with this gun again. You can't go back to shooting pheasants after you've used a weapon to clear a trench of human beings. The war ended for Vance on that hill. The battle for Okinawa dragged on for weeks, but the unit was pulled off the line for rest and refit. Then came the atomic bombs, then the surrender. The invasion of the Japanese mainland, the operation that everyone knew would be a bloodbath, was canceled. Vance went home. He took a train back to Nebraska. He carried a duffel bag with his uniform, his medals, and the paperwork for his discharge. He didn't talk much on the train. He watched the cornfields roll by, looking at the peaceful, green rows that looked nothing like the mud of Sugar Loaf. When he got to the farm, he put the duffel bag in the attic. He took the Winchester Model 12 out of its case. He didn't hang it over the fireplace. He didn't show it off at the local bar. He took it apart. He cleaned every spring, every screw, every inch of steel. He coated it in a heavy layer of grease, wrapped it in oilcloth, and put it in a wooden box at the back of his closet. He never fired it again. When his friends asked him to go hunting in the fall, he made excuses. He said he was too busy with the harvest. He said his back hurt. The truth was simpler. He couldn't stand the sound. The clack-clack of the pump action didn't remind him of flushed birds or crisp autumn mornings. It reminded him of the smell of cordite and the screams in the tunnels. It reminded him of the vibration in his bones when he slammed the trigger down. Vance lived a quiet life. He married a girl from the next town over. He raised 3 kids. He grew corn and soybeans. He served on the school board. To his neighbors, he was just a quiet, hardworking farmer who had done his bit in the war like everyone else. They didn't know about the 4 trenches. They didn't know that for one rainy morning in 1945, this gentle man had been the most terrifying thing on the island of Okinawa. They didn't know that the bird gun in his closet was a legendary weapon of war. Vance died in 2004. He was 81 years old. After the funeral, his grandson went into the closet to sort through his things. He found the wooden box. He opened it and unwrapped the oilcloth. The smell of old grease and steel filled the room. The grandson picked up the Winchester Model 12. It was heavy, solid. He saw the cracks in the wood of the forend. He saw the scratches on the receiver. He racked the slide. Clack, clack. The sound was crisp, mechanical, perfect. The grandson didn't know the story. He just thought it was a cool old gun. He didn't know that he was holding the trench broom that had broken the back of the Sugar Loaf defense. That is why we do this. That is why we dig through the archives and read the after-action reports. Because men like Vance don't brag. They don't write books about themselves. They do the impossible, they endure the unimaginable, and then they come home and go back to work. They let the memories fade. They let the stories die with them. But the stories shouldn't die. The story of the farmer's toy that silenced an army needs to be told. The story of the man who ignored the experts and trusted his gut needs to be remembered. The Winchester Model 12 wasn't just a shotgun, it was a symbol. It was proof that sometimes the old ways are the best ways. It was proof that in the chaos of war, you don't always need a computer or a scope or a satellite. Sometimes you just need mechanical reliability and the courage to stand your ground. Vance had both, and because of him, a lot of Marines came home who otherwise would have died in the mud of Okinawa. If you believe that these stories deserve to be saved from the dustbin of history, do me a favor. Hit that like button. It tells the algorithm that real heroism matters. It helps us find more stories like Vance's and bring them to the light. And if you haven't subscribed yet, join us. We are building a library of the forgotten, a monument to the men who did the work when the world was on fire. Leave a comment below if you had a grandfather who served in the Pacific. Tell us what he carried. Tell us his story. We want to hear it. Vance is gone now, but the echo of that pump action still rings in the history books. Clack clack. Thanks for watching. We'll see you in the next trench.